All right, so we're going to look at Revelation 13, the majority of the chapter this morning. We looked at verses 1 through 4 last week, and this week we'll look at verses 5 through 15 of Revelation chapter 13. So we've arrived at the reign of the beast, the great deceiver, that world ruler who is empowered by Satan himself, who is the dragon. And last week we saw his rise to power. And this week we'll talk about how he exercises his power and domain. And the surprising thing about this chapter, at least for me, when I looked at it again this week, is how the beast is in some ways outshone in his own reign and rule. Because this chapter on the reign of the beast ends up focusing more on the workings of the second beast, who's known as the false prophet. And there's something kind of symbolic about that to me, a picture of how no matter what Satan promises to us in sin, even when that sin may deliver on its promise, a man could cheat on his wife and get away with it. A teen could act cruel toward other teens and end up gaining more friends as a result of their cruelty. Even when it seems to benefit us from our sins, they still never play out the way that we would hope. There's still bitterness that comes in the end, and the reality is never what we would hope it would be. As this man who is the beast rises up over this beastly government, gets control over all the world, and then the one who ends up exercising the power for the most part ends up being someone else. And so let's remember that even when we think sin's promising us certain things and it'll deliver, someone's still ready to snatch away any pleasure that we could possibly get for it. So we're going to take a moment now to examine the reign of the beast, who's more popularly known as the Antichrist, even though I don't really overly like that term, but this is the singular ruler who will rule over the world during the second half of the tribulation. He probably rose to power during the first half of the tribulation, but then he steps into power at the midpoint of the tribulation, and we're going to see his actions in verses 5 through 7, and then the world's response to his actions in verses 8 through 10. There was given to him a mouth, speaking arrogant words and blasphemies, and authority to act for 42 months was given to him. And he opened his mouth in blasphemies against God, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle, that is, those who dwell in heaven. It was also given for him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And authority over every tribe and people and tongue and nation was given to him. So once again, based on the dating here, we are placed back in that 42-month time period of the two witnesses, and we see a ruler who will in every way be a mockery of Jesus, who is the true king. He's given a mouth to speak arrogance. Now the verb talking about how he's given that mouth, if you remember, that points us back to a little bit earlier in this book when we talked about the significance of God giving during this time period, reminding us that God is the one truly in power and authority, that even though the beast is giving this short leash to rule over this time period, to do terrible events, it will, relatively speaking, be a short time period. I mean, 42 months is a time that is here and is gone. So I think this points all to God's control and that he places limits on all things, even this terrible ruler. And in the midst of his 42-month rule, we can divide his actions into two basic categories. His actions are blasphemies against God and then attacks against God's people. I appreciated Robert Thomas's insight that John uses the aorist tense here, speaking of the beast's actions, which is probably telling us that what we read in verses 8 through 10 is a summary of all that he is going to do during these 42 months. So during these 42 months, you can summarize all of his actions as blasphemy against God or violence against the saints. Now, the blasphemy to me is the interesting part, in that the main focus here is not on blasphemy against God, but it is blasphemy against those who dwell in the heavenly tabernacle. Now, two options have been put forward as to who these people are who are dwelling in the heavenly tabernacle. I think probably both options are probably correct. The first option is that these are the saints who have been killed at his hand. So the beast is not content to simply slay God's people during this time, but even after he kills them, he will continue to mock them even in death. So this points to his level of cruelty, his level of hatred toward those that he is opposed to. But I think this is also blasphemy against the angels who are dwelling in heaven. And that makes sense as well, because if you remember, who's empowering the beast? It's the dragon. And what just happened to the dragon based on this narrative and Revelation? What just happened was Michael and the other angels just cast the dragon out of heaven. They just gave him a major defeat, trapping him, ensnaring him upon earth. And so the fact that they would blaspheme those angels in heaven that just defeated them should be no surprise as well. And one thing I think we should always remind ourselves when we come to this word blasphemy, because of how we use it today. Normally when we think of blasphemy, we think of that's taking God's name in vain. It's something reserved for how people talk about God and God alone. But the word blasphemy just means to slander. So it really can refer to any time that any person is slandered, lied about. So this is blasphemy, lying, slandering not only God himself, but also God's servants who are living in glory. Next, we read about the beast's attacks upon God's people. We already had a section looking at that when we talked about the dragon and the bride. The dragon and the woman, and the second half of that chapter. We read here that the beast will overcome the saints. This is the same word that's used earlier in the book of Revelation, talking about overcomers in the New Testament church. And so this is one place where I think God is actually mocking Satan and the beast. He's mocking them in this way, that the beast, the dragon, will assume that they have overcome the saints of God. Like, we have killed another of God's people and we are victorious. But are they really victorious? No, because those people that they're mocking, thinking they've overcome, they're just in glory. They are in a better place. They just transformed them to the worst time it's ever been on earth, to the glories of heaven. And so while they think they are overcoming the people of God, even in that, God is bringing an overcoming victory to them. So I think there's some humor that way sometimes in the scripture, but I think this is one of those places where I think God is clearly, he's mocking the dragon, he is mocking the beast, saying to them, you have wishful thinking that you're overcoming in what you're doing, because God will always be the final overcomer through faith in Christ. So we read here that the work of the beast is that he will slander God, he'll slander God's servants, and he will make war with God's people on earth. And then we get the response to those who are in the earth to the reign of the beast in verses 8 through 10. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, even everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who has been slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is destined for captivity, to captivity he goes. If anyone kills with the sword he must be killed. Here is the perseverance and the faith of the saints. So we see two responses here to the beast's rule. One is the world's response, and the other one is the saints' response. So the world will respond to the beast by worshiping him. They will praise him. They will serve him. And it appears that this is in response to his slander against God and his war on the saints. So what we read is that the world at large, they're going to actually love the beast's lies, and they're going to love his violence. Now, this is not the first time mankind has loved lies and violence. If we just think of the brutality of the Roman games in which John was living during his time period, people have loved lies and violence all throughout history. And all those who worship the beast will be all those whose names are not recorded in the Lamb's book of life. And I think bringing up this way is meant to show that there will be a universality in the worship of the beast, as in every person who is not a believer in the Lamb, they're going to instead worship the beast. They're going to bow down before him. There's going to be a universal, worldwide breadth to the kingdom of the beast that the kingdom of Rome, the Roman Empire, was never really able to have. That this will be a truly worldwide empire that is able to have as a result of the work of the beast. After the response of worship to him, we then get the response of the tribulation saints. And their response is actually worded more as advice than as a prophecy. We first see that it is advice based upon verse 9. When it says, if anyone has an ear, let him hear. And that's a way to say, I'm giving you wisdom, I'm giving you advice that you are to live on. You need to hear and you need to heed this. So it's not just understanding what's being said, but you need to have an ear so that you respond right. And the advice, I would sum it up in one word. And the advice is to persevere. These tribulation saints are not to worry about finding a way to overthrow the beast. Why do they not need to worry about overthrowing the beast? It's going to be 42 months until Jesus himself will come and overthrow the beast. They don't need to try to counter him. They don't need to try to have some actions through world governments, overthrowing him. They just need to trust in Christ and persevere during this time period. So I think this is advice that if you're living in this time period, do not in any way get caught up in politics or get caught up in man-creative endeavors to oppose the beast, because they will all fail. He's going to reign for 42 months, whether anyone on earth likes it or not. That's how long he will reign for. So their goal is to persevere. That means stand firm and witness. And in the midst of their witness for Jesus Christ, some will be imprisoned, some will be killed, but they still need to stand firm during this time period, which I think is ideal advice for Christians who are facing persecution. Just stand firm. Don't worship just to worship him to get along during that time period. Just stand firm against him. And that's the calling of the tribulation saints. And then this brings us to the beast's partner in crime, who's going to actually get more airtime in this chapter than the beast himself. And he's just simply called the second beast in this chapter. And let's look at him in verses 11 to 13. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth. And he had two horns like a lamb, and he spoke as a dragon. He exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence. And he makes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast, whose fatal wound was healed. He performs great signs, so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. So we're presented here with the second beast. He's got a pretty different, pretty starking different imagery that he has in compared to the first. He's described as a lamb with two horns who speaks like a dragon. And I think as far as the multitude of options, as far as what that imagery means, I think the one that I read that I think probably fits best with all the information is that the lamb with two horns speaking like a dragon means that he's in a subordinate position to the beast. So he's not seen as outwardly powerful. He would follow the commands and the will of the first beast. He's just a lamb in comparison to that hideous beast from before. Yet at the same time, his voice is the dragon's voice. So he still has the danger, the power, the influence, the impact on the world. It's just not to the degree of the first beast. His goal is to encourage the world to worship the first beast. And obviously, since we're talking about the beast who was wounded and healed, I think that's a way to say that we're not talking about the entire government here. He's not saying worship the government empire of the first beast, but to worship that individual person who was killed and rose again. And the way he goes about calling the world to worship the first beast is through, first, great signs. And that word signs should not be glanced over because we need to remember who wrote the book of the Revelation of Jesus Christ. It's John. What other famous book did he write in the New Testament? I mean, he's got multiple other ones, but one real famous one, that is the Gospel of John. And what is the key element that is driving the narrative of the first half of John? It's the 7 signs of Jesus. Right now in our 10 a.m. service, we're walking through a series, the 7 signs to trust in Jesus. And so that word for sign that John used in his gospel to talk about Jesus' ministry, John uses that same word here to talk about the works of the false prophet. So I see the repetition of that word sign as John saying that these miracles empowered by the dragon are one, to be seen as miracles. These are supernatural workings. These are not, sleight of hand tricks. This is not things that are happening by, computer animation that people think is real, but it's not. But these are genuine signs, but they'll be signs that'll be done in a mockery of the signs of Jesus Christ. And it's really easy to think about Jesus' signs, how you could easily do mock versions of them. Like, could he not turn water into wine for the sake of drunkenness and indulgence? Could he not heal men and women who are in the midst of violence and heinous behaviors so that they can continue to do more violence and heinous behaviors? Couldn't he have a mock form of the feeding of 5,000? That is all about pointless, terrible gluttony. So he will do signs like Jesus that will be a terrible mockery of what Jesus did in his ministry. And one sign that is noted is the calling down of fire from heaven. We know that was a sign of Elijah that was meant to point toward how Yahweh, the Lord, is the one true God instead of Baal. And so, of course, we're going to have this false prophet call fire down from heaven to point to the beast being the one true God in comparison to the Lord. And I could even see a scenario in this time period where the false prophet, entraps, imprisons Christians, calls them onto a mountain, he's onto a mountain, and in this scenario, he calls fire down from heaven, and the Christians do not. In a total mockery and sham of what we see in the Word of God. So it should remind us a little bit of what happened before Pharaoh when he had his false prophets do similar works before him during the time of the 10 plagues. But I think this is going to be signs in a way of, 100 times fold based upon what we saw in Egypt. And in the midst of all of his signs and workings to point people toward the worship of the beast, there are going to be 2 objects that will focus upon that worship of the beast that will be used by the false prophets. And this is probably in the running for maybe most famous section, pop culture-wise, of the book of Revelation. These 2 objects, they get a lot of time and ginning up people's imaginations. So let's talk about the 2 of them here. The first is in verses 14 and 15. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth because of the signs which it was given to him to perform in the presence of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image of the beast who had the wound of the sword and has come to life. And it was given to him to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast would even speak and cause as many as who do not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So we read here of the means by which the second beast, the false prophet, will deceive more and more of the world into worshiping the beast. And that is, there will be an image made to celebrate the fact that the beast has risen from the dead. And this image will be done in honor of that resurrection. Not necessarily that it's an image that might look exactly like him, but it'll be some icon, some picture that will remind people that the glory that this one individual died and rose from the dead. And there's a couple of intriguing things about this image. First is that this word for image was primarily used for 2 different things. So there's kind of 2 options of what this image could be. The first and most obvious is it could be a statue. So it could be a statue that comes to life, kills those who don't worship it, speaks before other people. Totally could happen. But the other thing is that the most common use actually for this word for image is this is talking about the image that is placed upon coins or currency. So this could be speaking to the fact that they have a currency that is created to celebrate the beast, and that currency itself in some way comes to life. That the coins that you actually have, that you are carrying in some way point toward the worship of the beast. Now, on the one hand, it would be kind of disturbing if a statue came to life. But the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, it would be way more disturbing if we all had these little coins in our pockets that people were carrying around. And those things that people had in their own hands that were spread all across the world, if those were what came to life and spoke and acted and led to people being killed. And this is somewhat speculation, so you can feel free to ignore what I'm about to say. But I think if Christ came back in the near future, I think probably the most likely way to bring this statue or images to life could actually end up being artificial intelligence. Because if you look at it right now, I think one of the big things that people are looking forward to, hoping in, is they want that first moment where there is a sentient artificial intelligence that thinks for itself beyond its programming. And if the false prophet could produce and introduce the first sentient artificial intelligence, people would instantly worship that. Like they are primed and ready to think that is the great thing. Like if you could have some little supercomputer in the palm of your hand that had artificial intelligence, people would celebrate that all around the globe if that suddenly happened right now. And what would also happen if you had artificial intelligence that you were carrying in your pocket? It would be like the world's most disturbing form of Big Brother. Because that artificial intelligence would know everything that you were doing. It would always be listening, always be watching. And if all of a sudden you did the wrong thing in comparison to what the government wanted you to do, it could immediately let anyone know that you were doing the wrong thing, and all of a sudden you're dead because of it. And so my speculation is that this could be some type of artificial intelligence thing. Pure speculation, but it just seems to kind of fit well with what's being described here. And then we go from the image of the beast to now the infamous mark of the beast in verses 16 to 18. And he causes all, the small and the great, and the rich and the poor, and the free men and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead. And he provides that no one will be able to buy or to sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast. For the number is that of a man, and his number is 666. So the false prophet is going to convince the world, from the lowest to the wealthiest, from the least connected to the most connected, that they all need to take a mark. And the reason they need to take this mark is that if you want to take part in commerce, if you want to be part of the worldwide marketplace of this government, you got to take the mark of this beast. And before we go on and talk more about this mark of the beast, I want to first make sure I'm explicitly clear in saying that we need to remember no one can take the mark of the beast today. You can't. It's not possible. It doesn't exist. It won't exist until the tribulation time period. So whatever someone does today to track people or to be involved in the economy, whether it's through their cell phones, credit cards, or maybe even there's some people who are getting a QR code tattooed on them where you could scan that QR code and then it would give you access to their banking. Kind of similar to the whole mark there, right there. No matter what you're doing, you cannot take the mark today. Even in China, where they need a specific form of digital currency that the government always has access to, that they can shut off and take away funds or add funds to at a moment's notice. Even that is not the mark of the beast. Even if, when the beast comes to power, he copies the technology of China or some of these other things to turn them into the mark, that still does not make what people are doing now to be the mark of the beast. No one can take the mark today. No one can get it. So no Christian should be afraid, oh, I can't do this or I shouldn't do that because that might mean I'm getting the mark and that might separate me and take me away from God. It doesn't mean that. None of them are us taking the mark today. So no one should fear it. No one should fret it. If anything, as technology advances more and more toward our ability to have the mark of the beast, it should just make us excited that Jesus is probably going to come back quicker. So if anything, all of this technology that could be used for the beast should make us be like, oh man, Jesus could come back anytime. So as soon as they came out with barcodes, like as soon as you could tattoo a barcode on somebody, like we had the mark right there. Like, you can do it with that. So anything else we do beyond that is, just more various ways to do the same thing. So no one should fear taking the mark of the beast. And in my opinion, based upon reading this, when it comes time for people to get the beast's mark, they will know exactly what they are doing. I don't believe anybody is going to get tricked into taking the beast mark. People will have their eyes open. They'll know exactly what they're doing, and they will say, give it to me. I want it. So don't be afraid of getting tricked into taking the mark. But now let's talk about the mark itself. There are two elements to it. The first element to it is related to commerce. And that is, it is related to both buying and selling, your ability to be part of the marketplace. If you want to be at all involved in the economy, you got to take this mark. And so the goal of the mark is obvious. And the goal is that they're going to try to starve out anyone who doesn't take the mark. Like that's just a simple way to do it. They'll be like, you can only hold out so long until you're going to be willing to take that mark. Second thing about the mark is that the mark will be physically placed on a person. It'll be placed on their forehand. It'll be placed on their forehead or on their right hand. In light of current technology, I think probably implanting a small chip in someone is probably the most likely way that something can happen. I lean toward that way because the advantage of having some chip implanted into you is that the beast can know everything that you're doing. Like if it's something that needs to be scanned, well, you can go do whatever you want while you're not being scanned and they're not tracking you. But if they put some kind of chip in you, then they always know what you're doing and can know what kind of activity you're involved in. So I'm going to guess they'll go that far where they'll be able to know what everybody's doing, where they are, track people all the time in society. So in some way, it'll be, taking this mark so they can track you, know everything that what you're doing. And if you refuse the mark, you will be entirely cut off from society. And I thought it was funny. I just got finished reading a book called Missionary to Mars. It's by Lucas Kitchen. Lucas came and spoke here at church, remember, a while back. And so he wrote a science fiction book. And in this science fiction book, it's called Missionary to Mars because it's like so far in the future that mankind has set up colonies on multiple planets, including Mars. And so it's somebody who's going to go to Mars to be a missionary to the scientists who are living on Mars. It was an interesting book, but the government in that book is called GovCorp because it's a one world government combined with a one world corporation, all put together into one. And I thought that was sort of an interesting nod to the government that we'll have at the end of that time period, with the corporation and government all rolled into one. And I think the mark is showing us that that is what is going to happen. That we'll have one economy ruling over everything, one government, and they'll all be the same. So this mark will allow us to take place in that marketplace, that economy. And then also the key to the mark is that once you have the mark on you, you will also have a visible mark that will either be the name of the beast on you, but if you don't want the name of the beast on you, you can just get his number on you. And so the number that is the number of the beast is the number 666. So let's talk about what that 666 means, since so many people have talked about that in the past. Just last week, I talked about the theory for that number, 666, being that number refers to Nero Caligula. And then there's a textual variant for like 4 or 5 manuscripts of Revelation that are 616, which would then point to Nero Caesar. And I talked last week why I don't like that theory of a historic view for the beast. And basically the reason I don't like that theory is that if you look at the beast, what he does when he's ruler of the world, Nero really did none of it. He never died and rose from the dead. And then the biggest thing about him is that he did not end his rule by having Jesus Christ come down and defeat him. So he didn't do those things. So it couldn't work for that. And the Roman Empire was never universal, never had this mark on all of the people. So none of that really fit for the Roman Empire at all. And so the two views that I think are reasonable as to what 666 means, and I say reasonable because there's probably like 300 wonky views as to what 666 means. But the first view is that 666 is the number of man, because 7 in the Bible so often means perfection or it means wholeness. We had the 7 days of creation, and so 7 is the number for wholeness. 6, though, is the number for man because we're not perfect, we're not whole, we're just regular flawed people, so our number is 6. And 3 6s in a row would mean that we are perfectly flawed. Perfectly imperfect, as if you were to have 777, that'd be a way of saying that God is thrice holy, he is perfectly holy. So that's saying we are perfectly imperfect, which would be a way of saying that we are as imperfect as we possibly could be. So that would be saying that this final government, this rule of the beast, is as imperfect as something could possibly be. They are totally flawed in everything that they do. And that's a pretty simplistic view because you're just taking the number 6, having an equal man, and being like, okay, that's how we got it. And that makes sense. But I don't really like that view, because what we're told here is that if you want to know what 666 means, if you want to know the significance, Revelation 13:18 says, "Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast." And so I hear the 6 equaling man and then the 666. I think that's pretty simple. Like, I think that's really basic. I don't think there takes a lot of calculating and wisdom for that. So I think it takes more wisdom and calculation to probably get to what the significance of that number means, which then leads me to the oldest view we have of the significance of this number in all of church history. And the oldest view, the first person we know of that wrote on this was Irenaeus, the Bishop of Lyons. And Irenaeus is most known for in church history for his writings against Gnosticism and all the terrible ways that Gnosticism was afflicting the church. Irenaeus was born around the year 130. He died in the year 202. So he's really early in church history, early enough that Irenaeus was still in that early group that believed there was going to be a real singular beast and that all of this stuff was still in the future, which should also tell us something interesting, that the first church writers who were actually living in the midst of the Roman Empire, they did not see the beast as one of the emperors of the Roman Empire that they were currently living under, but they still thought it was future. And if they thought it was future, well, it probably wasn't the Roman emperors of their time period. But Irenaeus had this view, and that is, it is impossible for us to calculate the number of the beast and know what it means. Because Irenaeus believes is that we are missing the key piece of information in order to calculate the significance of the number. And that is, we don't know the beast's name. Until you know the beast's name, you cannot calculate the significance of the number. So it's basically saying there's this math problem, and to get the solution of it, there's a piece of it that we don't have. And so we don't have enough information in order to calculate the significance of that number. But once the beast's name is revealed, once you're living during that time period, you'll see the 666, you'll see his name, and you'll be like, I got it. I can figure that out. That totally makes sense that this is what it's going to be. But until we know his name, we're not going to be able to calculate it at this time period. And I actually think that that's probably the most reasonable of all views to have when it comes to this number, to say that it is a significant number, it will relate to that name. There's going to take some mathematics to calculate what it is, but it'll totally make sense to everybody once we get to that time period. But that also causes us to have a little humility, because this is something that we need to look at and say, I know that the beast is going to have that number 666, but I just can't know what it means. I'll know what it means once I know his name, But since I don't know his name, I'm not going to know the significance of that number. So I'm going to fall in line with Irenaeus and say that's one thing that guy got right. And Irenaeus he's one of the good church fathers. I mean, one of the interesting things about Irenaeus is that a lot of people love to dump on Irenaeus and say that he was just making stuff up because he wrote things that Gnostics believed, and people were like, they could not have believed that stuff. Like, the things that he wrote are just kind of bonkers, and nobody would believe those things. And then about 150 years ago, we started finding all of these old Gnostic writings and, unearthing them and translating them. And then when we found actual Gnostic writings, people were like, oh, I guess Irenaeus knew what he was talking about, and they really believed those kind of things. And this guy had things in line well. So I'm just going to line up with him and say I'm going to go with the original view as to what 666 means, which is we don't know what it means. But what do we know based on this chapter of Revelation is that there will be a great adversary in the last days. He will go by the name the Beast. He will have a second beast who will work with him. Then that time period, they will do some of the most awful, heinous, terrible things in all of world history. I think the closest in our history that we've had to what the beasts will do are what we see in the modern totalitarian communist governments that track everything a person does and has war against the church and the saints. And so I think we get a small taste of what they're like in our modern time period that we have. And maybe it's in God's plan that we get this modern taste of it in a short time before Christ returns. And so I think we get a little glimpse of what their reign would be like. But the other key to this chapter is the again repeated time period. That this is going to be 42 months. It's going to be 3.5 years. That God has an end time plan for that beast. And when his time comes, he will be destroyed as thoroughly as one could possibly be destroyed, as the first person who will get cast into the lake of fire, which we'll see later in this book. So in the midst of the reading about these distressing times, let us never forget that in the end, Christ will return, and in the end, Christ will be victorious.